You think you know Henry VIII. The man with 6 wives, the king who split from Rome, the face stamped on history textbooks. But the truth is far more grotesque than the polite myths we're told. Henry wasn't just a king. By the end of his life, he was a living horror story, a rotting monster ruling England from a throne of flesh that was literally decaying beneath him. Imagine a man so enormous, so swollen with disease, that he could barely be moved without specially designed machines. Henry's waist measured 54 inches, wider than the height of most medieval men. He weighed nearly 400 pounds in a time when the average Englishman weighed less than half that. But this isn't just a story of obesity. His body had become a battlefield. His legs were riddled with ulcers, giant craters of rotting flesh that oozed pus daily. These wounds never healed. They festered endlessly, filling rooms with a stench so revolting that courtiers covered their faces with perfumed rags just to stand in his presence. Some accounts claim the smell could be detected from entire rooms away. His servants? They dreaded him not just for his temper, but for the physical punishment of being forced to dress him, gagging as they worked near those open sores. And yet, Henry clung to his image as God's chosen king. He wrapped himself in silk and jewels, parading as if nothing was wrong, while underneath the garments his body was a collapsing ruin. Modern doctors suspect he may have suffered from Cushing's syndrome or complications from a traumatic brain injury after a disastrous jousting accident. That head injury, one that left him unconscious for hours, may have flipped a switch inside him, transforming him from a golden young prince into the paranoid tyrant history remembers. By his last years, the once energetic king could not even walk unaided. He had to be hauled from place to place like a carcass on wheels, pieces of flesh sometimes dropping from his body as he was moved. He became a prisoner of his own decaying shell, a monarch surrounded by jewels and banners, but betrayed by the very body that symbolized his divine power. And yet, even in this grotesque state, Henry wielded absolute power over life and death. That's the part that makes his story terrifying. England was ruled by a man who was, in every sense, rotting alive. If you're already horrified by this glimpse into Henry VIII's reality, trust me, this is only the beginning. What comes next will make your history books look like fairy tales. And before we dive deeper, if you're fascinated by the dark, forbidden truths that schools never teach, hit that like button and subscribe. Because you're about to learn the secrets of a king whose nightmare body was just the surface of something far worse. Everyone remembers Henry VIII for his 6 wives. It's almost a joke in popular culture. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. But reduce it to a rhyme and you strip away the real nightmare. These weren't wives. They were captives. They were pawns in a psychological war orchestrated by a man who treated marriage like a hunting ground and execution like a stage play. Take Anne Boleyn. Most people know she was executed, but few understand the horror she endured before the sword fell. Henry didn't simply accuse her, he staged an elaborate fiction. Her own musician was tortured until he confessed to sleeping with her. 5 innocent men, including Anne's own brother, were dragged into the trap and executed before her eyes. Imagine standing in the tower, forced to watch your brother's head roll because your husband, the King of England, had convinced himself of a fantasy. That wasn't justice. It was theater. And Anne was the grand finale. Then there was Catherine Howard. Barely more than a teenager when Henry married her, she was plucked from obscurity into a world where saying no was impossible. When Henry discovered she had once known love before him, he changed the law of England itself, making it treason for a queen to conceal her sexual past. Imagine the cruelty of rewriting the legal system just to destroy a teenage girl who disappointed him. Catherine was dragged screaming to her death, another victim in Henry's endless hunger for control. Even Catherine of Aragon, his first queen, wasn't spared. Cast aside after decades of loyalty, she spent her final years under house arrest, forbidden from seeing her daughter, Mary. Rumors spread by Henry painted her as mad. She died isolated, her letters to Henry ignored, her body weakened by stress and sorrow. Henry's cruelty wasn't always a sword. Sometimes it was silence, neglect, and exile. And the so-called lucky ones. And of Cleves survived only because she pretended their marriage never existed, signing papers that erased her from the royal bed. Jane Seymour, hailed as the one who gave Henry his son, died from childbirth, and Henry was already eyeing his next bride before her funeral was cold. There was no escape. Divorce meant disgrace. Refusal meant execution. Even obedience offered no guarantee. These women lived in a court where love was a weapon, intimacy was surveillance, and every smile from Henry could be followed by a death sentence. To marry Henry was to step into a gilded prison where the walls closed in slowly, suffocatingly, until you either broke or bled. And this was only one part of the nightmare. Because while his wives lived in fear of his moods, the entire kingdom was held hostage by something else entirely, his appetite. By the time Henry VIII reached the height of his power, his appetites had grown into something monstrous. This was a man who consumed more than 5,000 calories every day, double the needs of a grown soldier. But Henry's meals weren't just about hunger. They were about domination, about performance, about feeding a king who believed the entire kingdom existed to fill his belly. Picture the scene: tables groaning with whole pigs roasted to a crisp, mountains of bread, rivers of wine. His kitchens employed more than 200 servants, preparing hundreds of dishes daily. Not for the people. Not for nobles. For Henry. For one man. He would gorge himself for hours in front of the court like a grotesque theater production, each bite a display of his authority. The courtiers weren't just watching a king eat, they were watching the embodiment of greed consume an empire. But beneath the indulgence was fear. Every morsel Henry ate had to be tasted by multiple servants first. Not just once, but sometimes twice. And then he would wait, 30 agonizing minutes, to see if the tasters collapsed dead before daring to touch the food himself. He ordered guards to stand watch over his kitchens, inspecting every spice, every pinch of salt, as if the meal were a battlefield. Eating, the most human act, became a military operation. This paranoia didn't stop at the dinner table. Henry filled his palaces with hidden passageways, peepholes, and secret doors. He slept with crossbows by his bed and daggers under his pillow. Guards stood inside his chambers all night, watching their king snore. He didn't trust his nobles. He didn't trust his servants. He didn't even trust his own children, placing spies on Princess Mary and Princess Elizabeth to ensure they weren't plotting against him. And his paranoia infected everyone around him. Courtiers whispered carefully, knowing the wrong word could see them hauled to the tower. Neighbors spied on neighbors. Informants reported on informants. Henry built a kingdom where fear was the currency, loyalty was tested daily, and betrayal, real or imagined, was punished with fire and steel. The once vibrant court of England had transformed into a suffocating nightmare, a palace that smelled of rotting flesh, where feasts looked like funerals, and where silence was safer than speech. But if you think his reign of terror ended when his life did, you're wrong. Because the most grotesque horror of all was not how Henry lived, but how he died. For most men, death brings peace. For Henry VIII, it brought one last act of chaos, and one final humiliation that still echoes through history. By his final weeks, the once golden Prince of England had become a bloated shadow of himself. He could no longer walk. Servants hauled him around on wheeled chairs like a slab of meat, his ulcers leaking pus, his body shedding pieces of rotting flesh that had to be collected off palace floors. His skin was stretched tight and shiny, as if it might split open at any moment. Even his own doctors, hardened by medieval horrors, gagged at the smell when they entered his chamber. When he finally died in January of 1547, no one rushed to his side. Few dared even confirm his passing, terrified of being accused of treason if they spoke too soon. The most powerful king in Europe, now a silent, swollen corpse that no one wanted to touch. But the horror was only beginning. His body, massive and decaying, swelled with gases of decomposition. The coffin makers tried everything, wrapping him in lead sheets, sealing him inside reinforced wooden boxes. But even death couldn't contain Henry. During the funeral procession to Windsor, the unthinkable happened. His coffin exploded. The pressure from within burst the seals, and his remains leaked out into the road. Witnesses reported dogs licking up the royal fluids. The king who claimed divine right, who demanded absolute obedience, who had once been worshipped as the very embodiment of England, reduced to a feast for stray animals on a country highway. And even in burial, the chaos continued. The grave dug for him collapsed repeatedly under the sheer weight of his coffin, as if the earth itself was rejecting him. 4 years afterward, people claimed foul smells and strange noises seeped from his tomb. His legend didn't fade with his death, it rotted on, haunting the very ground where he was laid. Henry VIII's legacy isn't just 6 wives or the Church of England. It's the warning of what happens when unchecked power feeds on flesh, fear, and paranoia until nothing human is left. He ruled with the authority of God, but died as something less than a man. His body betrayed him. His paranoia consumed him. His hunger, his cruelty, his fear, they didn't just destroy a king. They poisoned an entire kingdom. So next time you hear the rhyme, divorced, beheaded, died, remember this. Henry VIII wasn't just a tyrant of politics. He was a tyrant of flesh, mind, and spirit. A king whose very body turned into the final horror story of his reign. And if you want more dark truths that history books bury, subscribe now. Because Henry VIII was just the beginning. And there are far worse monsters hiding in the past.